and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Michel Gurfinkiel, a fellow at the Middle East Forum, join us to discuss Demographics is Destiny. France once conquered Africa. Now Africa is taking over France. Mr. Gurfinkiel will speak for 10 to 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to all questions, but we have many participants on this webinar today. So I apologize in advance if we do not get to yours. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Michel Gurfinkiel.
Hello, I'm very pleased to meet you today. I would like to stress the demographic dimension in present geopolitics. And one very interesting example in this respect is certainly the relationship between France and her former Islamic colonies in North Africa. I would like to stress the fact that France indeed has been a very important imperial nation. It's first in the 17th, 18th century, then again the 19th, 20th century. And at one point, by the middle of the 20th century, France's colonial empire was second only to the British Empire. The French got involved in North Africa almost by chance. It so happened that there were some difficulties between the government of France and the government of Algeria in the late 1820s. One should remember that by that time, the governments of the various countries in North Africa had very problematic relations with Western countries. For instance, America, as it is, I believe, well known, created the Marine Corps in order to conduct a military operation against the barbaresque powers, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, in 1801. There were many problems between the North African countries and the Western countries. Some were financial. That was the case in the difficulties between France and Algeria. And some were of completely different nature. The countries in North Africa were used to some kind of piracy against the Western merchant ships. And of course, the Western powers were not very happy about it and were looking to, seeking to finish that situation. All in all, the French conducted a limited operation against Algiers, which was by then the capital city of a kind of Turkish semi-autonomous government in Algeria. And what happened was totally unexpected. It happened that the Turkish regent or viceroy of Algeria simply abandoned Algiers after the French attacked, and the French were able it was just an affair of a few days to seize Algiers. And then the French wondered what they could do now. Should they stay in Algiers? Should they conquer the whole country of Algeria? Should they simply withdraw to France after having taught a lesson to the people there, and especially to the rogue government there. Eventually, the French decided to stay and to undertake the conquest of the entire former Turkish Ottoman regency of Algiers. But that time, the French population, global population, was of about 30 million people, whereas the population of Algiers was of 3 million souls only. So there was a demographic ratio between the French and the Algerians of 10 to 1, 10 to 1. Combined with a much superior technological and military power on the side of the French envisioned an easy and quick conquest of the country. It happened that things did not proceed so smoothly as expected. In fact, the war of conquest of Algeria was a protracted struggle for one quite lengthy period of time. The Algerians managed to create a kind of strong Islamic state against the French, but all in all, after some 16, 17 years of war, the French eventually were able to entirely pacify Algeria and to turn it into a colony. And even not just a colony, they had this very French, very Gallic, and some would say very strange attitude to turn Algeria as an integral part of the French state itself. There are many reasons why the French made such a decision. It has to do with French culture, and especially French culture after the French Revolution, with its insistence on kind of rational and universalist vision of manhood. But in the end of the day, the French pretended that Algeria was just as French as, say, Brittany, Burgundy, or Provence, was an integral part of France as a country and as a nation. Quite obviously, the facts on the grounds did not fit entirely with this vision. The fact was that most Algerians, many of them were Muslim Arabs, others were Muslim Berbers, and there was also a tiny minority of Jewish Algerians. Most of them thought of themselves as being primarily Muslims or Jewish, and were not interested, in fact, into trading their identity for a different secular French identity. The French, in fact, offered a kind of bargain to their Algerian subjects. They could agree to become full-fledged French citizens. In order to do that, all they had was to accept the civil code of France. And that was asking too much, as seen from a Muslim point of view, because it passed for a kind of apostasy of Islam. And most Muslim Algerians, in fact, declined to undergo such a an oath of allegiance to the French culture and the French government as such. The Jews were more interested, and eventually in 1870, they globally were bestowed French citizenship. But there were an exception. The vast majority of the native Algerians were, in fact, reluctant to become France. So you had a very strange situation where, on the one hand, France said that Algeria was an integral part of herself, and on the other hand, you had a situation where most of the native inhabitants of Algeria were in fact deprived of civic equality. This situation could be perhaps sustained for a long period of time, as long as the demographic ratio stayed more or less what it had been at the moment of the conquest. But it happened that, in fact, the native population of Algeria grew much quicker than the population of metropolitan France and of a small, sizable but still small French colonial settlement in Algeria. So much so that by 1962, at the moment Algeria won its war of independence there against the French, there was the ratio had changed dramatically. There were in metropolitan France about 50 million citizens, 50 million people, residents, whereas in Algeria you had something like 11 million people, among them 10 million native Muslims, and about 1 million French citizens, some of them colonial settlers, and a minority among them the Jewish French citizens of Algeria. In 1962, de Gaulle organized for Algeria to vote in a referendum, and it didn't come as a surprise that, in fact, most native Algerians voted for complete independence. It should be stressed that at the same time, a parallel referendum was held in France, and a majority among the French living in metropolitan France agreed to the complete independence of Algeria at the same time. The French had this vision that the colonial era was over, and that the special ties that had existed between France and colonies, and especially Algeria, were simply finished. The ties were severed for once and for all. That was the vision in France. What happened since Algeria has become independent has betrayed that vision. Now, what is the demographic ratio between France, Algeria, and between France and former colonies or protectorates in North Africa? Back to 1830, as I said, there were 30 million people in France, 3 million in Algeria, and possibly something like 3 to 4 million people in the other countries of North Africa. So that was the ratio at the moment of the conquest, when the conquest was started. Today, the situation is completely different. We have 67 million people who are citizens of the French Republic. which means citizens of metropolitan France and of some overseas territories that are as French as, for instance, Alaska or Hawaii are American. And on the other end, we have 43 million people in Algeria. We have something like 35 million people in Morocco. We have 12 million people in Tunisia. All in all, the former French Africa now is something like 100 million strong. To that, you must add as well, probably, the countries of Islamic sub-Saharan Africa, countries which can be described as more African than North African. And these countries are also undergoing a very dynamic demographic growth. And what happened now is that all these countries that used to be the colonies, the protectorates, or the overseas territories of France, still see France as a country with which they have special ties, except that the former situation where the French, meaning the white Christian French, used to dominate, and now they don't dominate anymore. And it is now the former subjects, the Muslim subjects of North Africa, or the Muslims or non-Muslim subjects of sub-Saharan Africa, that in some way have been entitled to dominate the French African space. This situation has perhaps not been, explicitly expressed, but nevertheless, it is very much part of the background of the problems that we have in between France and Africa today. And especially, and this is my last word, this situation is the background to the religious or even the racial problems that are gathering in metropolitan France itself. There is a vast community of people that immigrated from the former African colonies that lives now in France, and they tend gradually to share that view that in fact France belongs to them from now on, just the way they had belonged to France. I'm ready for some questions.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So the first question we have is, you can touch on the other countries as well, but do these same issues exist for former French colonies, particularly Africa south of the Sahara? If not, why not?
Okay, I would say that the problem is especially intense when it comes to Algeria, because Algeria was seen as part of France. No native government was, allowed in Algeria the way you had an imperial government in Morocco and a regency in Tunisia. There was a modicum of national identity in Morocco and Tunisia that was known in Algeria. So much so that once the Algerians have achieved independence, they have achieved an independence within the frame of the former French state. And as much as they have been immigrating to France, to metropolitan France, the former metropolitan France, in fact, they have a feeling that they move from one part to the other part of what used to be one country. So you cannot expect from the rank and file of these immigrants to understand all the technicalities of this situation. The feeling, I'm not talking here about what is written in the books, I'm talking about a global feeling. The feeling is that once the French were the bosses, and now it's the time for the Algerians especially, but it is true also to some extent, and it's getting more truer and truer about the other former colonial nations.
Wonderful, thank you. How much of the motivation of these ex-colonies come from simple reaction to the colonization, and how much is tied up with the Dawa of Islam?
It's a very intricate question. I will certainly not say that the French rule in Algeria and in other places were perfect and totally benign. But on the other hand, the mere fact that there was such an important demographic growth throughout the colonial rule of France means that the French allowed for such a growth, that they allowed for their subject to be fed, to enjoy access to medicine, and so on and so on. So again, we are talking about a time where inequality between colonial powers and the colonies was seen as something natural, perhaps to be corrected with time, but still something totally natural. And I believe that by that standard, the French did not rule their colonies in such a totally awful way. There is an important element of resentment, no discussion about it. But this element of resentment is getting more and more a fantasy, because the more we move, the more, in fact, the French are very careful to create a situation of equality between them and their former colonies. And I believe that there is a great part of ideology or infatuation about the resentment of the former colonial nations against France.
Thank you. Going forward, will France just capitulate, or will there be a reaction to the demographic issues?
That's a very interesting question. First and foremost, the main problem is that the French, just like the other Europeans or maybe the other Westerners, have developed, especially since World War II, a global worldview, a global ideology by which there should not be any kind of nationalism, of national, ethnic, or racial reaction against immigration or against the assertiveness of the former slaves or the former colonized people and so on. And it's very difficult for the French to overcome this ideological framework. The moment they start to overcome it, there is a further problem. It is that this reaction can be hijacked effectively by the far right or by all kinds of extremist parties. And again, this is creating a difficulty in order to react in a rational way to the challenge of immigration or let's call it, resentment on the part of the former colonial subject. Will the French be able today to resist a further disintegration of their country as a nation state, an homogeneous nation state? I have no idea, but I believe that a lot of people in France think that it's already too late, and that the only perspective, sustainable perspective, should be to allow the native French to keep their identity in face of the neo-French, the French from the former colonies.
Thank you. So I'm sure a lot of that has to do with the differences between the birth rates. What do you attribute this to?
Difference between?
Birth rates, population growth.
Oh, okay. There are probably 2 or 3 reasons to be considered. Up to a point, it's certainly religion. The Muslims still have a strong and demanding religion, still stress or enforce family values, the authority of parents, the authority of the fathers. And this framework is conducive to stable family life and by implication to a high birth rate. A second reason is that the French social system is a kind of very comprehensive welfare state that offers a lot of incentives for families to grow, but it depends, of course, on the citizens themselves to make use of that incentives or not. The sad truth is that most of the non-Muslims in France today have joined the global Western way of life, which means that they are reluctant to have stable marriages, to be married at all, to grow families and so on. Whereas and therefore they don't make an extensive use of the welfare state, whereas the immigrants who have strong family values do make an extensive use of the welfare state. So this is a second reason. And then there is a third reason, and the third reason is simply what I described as the culture of resentment, and the culture that, according to which this is really the time of the former subject. It's good to have a lot of children in France if you are if you come from Algeria or from any other former French colony, because you have a revenge to take against you have to dispossess the native French, and it's only fair, it's only justice. This is the way they look at it. This is a difficult situation. I'm not sure, nobody can say that this is going to be the situation that will still prevail in 10 years from now or 20 years from now and so on. Nobody knows, but there is a trend according to which, in fact, the global, the community identity of the Muslims, which means the immigrants in France, will be strengthened. For instance, take religion. The observance of the Muslim religion in France is getting stronger and stronger from one decade to the other decade. Some 25 years ago, we have figures. 25 years ago, there were about less than 30% of the French Muslims who said they were observing the fast of Ramadan. Today, the people who identify as Muslims, when asked, say 70% of them say that they pay attention to Ramadan and they keep Ramadan. Which means that when you think at what Ramadan really entails, that means certainly that there has been a spectacular growth in religious observance among the French Muslim. And religious observance means global collective identity of the Muslim community.
All right, thank you so much. We have unfortunately run out of time. We have so many questions that have come in. Can you just tell us real quick where we can find more information on your work?
First and foremost, I would like to remember everyone that I did in 1997, for the Middle East Quarterly, study on the impact of immigration in France. And this story, which is available, I think, quite easily, has been, in fact, a kind of landmark in the appreciation of the immigration problem in France. It has stayed for 20 years, I believe, as one of the 10th more frequently consulted articles in the Middle East Quarterly.
All right, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Mr. Gurfinkiel, for speaking with us today. Please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern.
I'll be delighted, of course, to answer any further question that may be conveyed by the Middle East Forum to me.
Wonderful, thank you. So please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for Ashley Perry's weekly Israel Insider Update and Barak Bechdel's Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.